The Greens, they are a combination of the lunatic, the deranged, and the evil.
When we're talking Nazi level Jew hatred and others who celebrated 7th of October and so on.
The adoption by virtually every progressive person of the Palestine cause which has come to define and embody morality itself. It has been led by Islamists, by people who are using the Palestinian cause to advance an agenda which actually has the West itself in its sights. I have described the Palestinian cause as a Trojan horse. Conscience in the West has simply been hijacked and turned into its opposite. And this is, it's like a spiritual plague that has descended upon us.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest today, Melanie Phillips. Melanie, welcome to the show.
Hello, Brendan. Good to be with you again.
It's great to have you back on. There is always so much I want to ask you about and get your wisdom on. And the list of things grows longer every day because crazy things happen every day. And I often find myself thinking, what's Melanie going to say about this? What is Melanie going to write about this? So it's always good to get your voice of reason. I guess I want to kick off just by asking you about where the land lies in Britain at the moment. So we've had the local elections. Labour got a drubbing, as listeners will know. The Green Party did well in some areas, but perhaps not as well as people had expected. Hopefully not. Things have been shaken up quite a lot. I wonder where you think politics stands in the UK. Are things getting better? Are people sick and tired of what they've been putting up with? How do you see things here?
I'm afraid to say things are not getting better. I would like to say that they are, but I find it hard to find any rays of light in the situation. I don't know what's going to happen with the Labour Party. But frankly, the problem is not Keir Starmer. Certainly the likely candidates lined up to succeed him are all pretty awful because they would take Labour further down into the same rabbit hole that they're in already, which is broadly the agenda of the left. You can call it soft left, medium left, whatever. It's the left. And it doesn't work. And the electorate is sick to death of it, and which is why they are all busily voting for reform, because they have written off the Conservative Party after all those years of mismanagement by the Conservative government, or Conservative governments successive Conservative governments. They've written that off as a party they could never support again. So it's very hard to see what's going to happen. I mean, what is it, 3 years until the next election? We are told, well, we can see that, Reform have had a very good local government election set of results, which is what we kind of expected. It's very much a protest vote, isn't it? People are desperate. They want, something that is not the mainstream political establishment that has failed them so badly. But 3 years is a long time, and a lot can happen before then. And so I think Britain is in a pretty bad state at the moment.
Starting out is never easy. Anyone who's launched a project, whether it's a business, a publication, or even a podcast, will know that feeling. You're committing time and money without any guarantee of things working out. That's where having the right infrastructure really matters. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, from household names like Gymshark and Mattel to people just starting out with an idea and a laptop. One of the great things about Shopify is that you don't need to be a tech expert to get started. Its handy design studio comes with hundreds of ready-to-use templates, so you can build a professional-looking online shop without spending weeks wrestling with code. Shopify also helps you operate efficiently. Whether you're uploading products, managing inventory, or shipping internationally, it's all handled in one place, which means less time faffing around and more time actually running your business. Shopify also has a range of built-in marketing tools, from email campaigns to social media integrations, so you can reach customers without needing a full-time marketing department. They even offer AI tools to help write product descriptions, improve page headlines, and sharpen how your products are presented, which is useful if words aren't your strong suit. And you know that purple Shop Pay button you've probably seen everywhere? That's Shopify. It's trusted by millions of shoppers and designed to reduce abandoned carts, meaning more people actually follow through and buy. It's time to turn those what-ifs into with Shopify today. Sign up for your £1 per month trial today at shopify.co.uk/Brendan. Go to shopify.co.uk/Brendan. That's shopify.co.uk/Brendan. Yeah, I think many listeners to this podcast will agree with that. I did want to ask you particularly about the Green Party, because sometimes I found them quite entertaining because they say the stupidest things, but other times I found them quite terrifying because they do seem to embody the Islamo-left, that kind of unholy alliance that you and others have been writing about for some time. You got Zack Polanski at the figurehead of this, the leader of this party. They are riddled with anti-Semitism. There have been many exposés of candidates who called Jews cockroaches. I mean, we're talking Nazi level Jew hatred, and others who celebrated 7th of October and so on. Really scary stuff. What have you made of the Green Party and the discussion around it as well?
Well, it's totally terrifying because they are a combination of the lunatic, the deranged, and the evil. And that's before they hook up with the Islamic part of this terrible alliance. They are people that in a previous era, when people were broadly governed by reason, evidence, facts, common sense, they would have been regarded as fringe artists who would be regarded with, pity, and you give them a bit of spare change to make sure they don't starve. And now, where they're being talked about as being part of the next government. What's terrifying to me is that there are thousands and thousands of, as far as I can see, mainly young people in Britain who don't regard them as absolutely ludicrous, who don't regard them as infantile, who don't regard them as noxious, racist, vicious, bigoted, which is what they are, and regards them instead as, it's like the cavalry is arriving. And this is the result of many things, but partly it's the result of decades of an education system which has been taken over by what I would call a Marxist view of the world. Doesn't mean that the teachers are Marxists. Most of them, the vast majority, would laugh at the suggestion. But the kind of cultural parameters within which they have been teaching for decades are basically Marxist, dividing up the world into powerful and powerless in a cartoon universe of black and white, no nuance, in which knowledge has been replaced by propaganda, truth has been replaced by opinion. I mean, young people do not understand the difference between opinion and fact. They assume that opinion is evidence, it is fact. And all that has meant that they have become the phrase useful idiots comes to mind, but it's far worse than that. They have become the kind of cannon fodder of the war to colonize the Western mind, which I think, this is a longer story, but it goes back to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union realized that it could never expect the workers of the West to rise up and, seize the levers of economic and political power. But what they could do was to infiltrate the minds of the West through the universities and the schools, and then the establishment professions, and turn what was a coherent society which ran along historic lines into a society which despised what it was and sought to destroy it from inside. That's precisely what has happened, and it's given the opportunity of a lifetime, many lifetimes, to Islamists who perceived very shrewdly a long time ago that Britain was at the very center of all this. Britain, the most godless country. I like to think, I've said this in the past, Britain was kind of first into the Enlightenment and is now first out. And the Islamists saw this, and they saw, a society that no longer knew what it was, certainly no longer liked what it was, without doubt would never defend what it was, and consequently the way was open for them to move in. And so you have this terrible alliance between the people from kind of the inside, the product of the British education system over many decades, hooking up with people from the outside, including obviously people who now live in Britain, but a culture that comes from the outside, determined to conquer and colonize and destroy Western society and conquer and colonize Britain for Islam. And that's how you have this terrible alliance. And the Greens are, seizing that opportunity, explicitly hooking up with Islamists, people who are demonstrably and self-evidently marching to the tune of Islamism, which is the attempt to colonize, conquer the non-Muslim world for Islam.
Very well described for what's going on with the Green Party. And I did want to ask you specifically about Zack Polanski, because one thing that's very interesting, you've noticed this and you've spoken about it before, is that whenever someone now says, listen, the Green Party seems to have a problem with anti-Semitism, lots of its candidates and supporters are saying anti-Semitic things, Zack Polanski and his supporters will say, look, this is the only party in Britain currently, only mainstream party currently led by a Jewish man. This is preposterous. How can you say this? The Jewish journalist Nicole Lampert, she used a very striking phrase. She said that Polanski is helping to kosherize anti-Semitism and sell it to the left as something almost respectable. How do you see the role that he's playing in relation to that problem you've just described there?
As you described, that is correct. He is a person of Jewish ancestry who is an enemy of the Jewish people. Now, people who don't know about the history of the Jews might well assume that that's a contradiction in terms. But unfortunately, the history of the Jewish people is absolutely studded with Jews who have turned against the Jewish people and who have hooked up with those elements in the wider society that want to destroy the Jewish people and have acted as their cheerleaders and have acted as their enforcers. And I'm afraid, Jewish history is peppered with these kind of people. Now, one may well ask, well, what is the reason for that? And I'm afraid that takes us into the realms of psychology and sociology and, whatnot. But Zack Polanski is not alone. There are, I'm afraid, many people who are ethnic Jews, if you like, people who are Jews in Britain and broadly the West as well, but in Britain, who have very little connection with the Jewish community, don't identify as Jews except insofar as they are viciously antipathetic to the state of Israel and help propagate the libels, the blood libels, the terrible lies about Israel. They have been used for decades by people like the BBC, who have delighted over many years in putting into a radio or TV studio two Jews. It's been called Jew baiting, like cock baiting. You put into the studio two Jews, one of whom is somebody who is of Jewish ancestry but has a tangential connection with the community and hates Israel and is prepared to propagate these terrible lies that are told about it, versus somebody who is a defender of Israel and a proud Jew. And you watch to see who wins. And it's a disgusting spectacle, but the broadcasting authority can say, well, we're not being anti-Jew. Look, we've got a Jew. We've got two Jews in the studio. And many people who deploy the war against Israel, the war to delegitimize Israel through falsehoods and lies and distortions and all that, they will use the fact that there's this person and that person who is a Jew who is saying it, and therefore it can't be anti-Jew. And this is a disgusting thing, and it's one of the great tragedies of the Jewish people. But I would say one other thing. For perfectly proper and reasonable reasons, it's very important to say that this is a form of anti-Semitism. However, it's also important not to get hung up on this word anti-Semitism, because the issue is anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism is an evil in itself. Now, the distinction is always made. I am an anti-Zionist, but I'm not anti-Jew. I can't be anti-Semitic because being anti-Zionist is fine because I'm simply opposing a country, Israel. And therefore, that's all fine because that's a political thing. Zionism is a political ideology. And consequently, you can't accuse me of being a bigot. That's the argument. That argument in itself is absolutely bogus. You don't have to go down the road of saying, actually, this is anti-Semitism, which actually I think it is, but you don't have to go down that road. You can simply say, you should simply say, singling out a country for the treatment that is afforded to Israel is itself a vile bigotry, because you are singling out Israel for treatment afforded to no other country, people, or cause on earth. You are targeting it systematically with falsehoods, demonization. You are depicting it as not only a bad place, but the worst place in the world, the cause of all the ills of the world. You are literally demonizing. You're making it devilish, and consequently, this in itself is crazy, it's deranged, it's obsessional, it's inexplicable, and it is a form of bigotry, and it has to stop. Now, that argument, I'm afraid, hasn't been made enough, but that is, I think, very important to say, because it's very important that people should not get away with this idea that, just denouncing Israel is perfectly okay, whereas denouncing Jews is not.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised the issue of anti-Zionism as its own specific form of bigotry, and I think increasingly the worst kind of bigotry that afflicts the West right now, just this kind of poisonous, mad hatred for the Jewish nation. I did want to ask you a few things about anti-Zionism and what it means and what we might do about it. I guess to continue with the theme of the Jew baiting that you referred to earlier by the BBC and others, the one distinction that the left often makes is between anti-Zionist Jews and Zionist Jews, and they will often upfront so-called anti-Zionist Jews, even though they are a minority, and they will say, look at what as you say, look what these Jews are saying. It can't possibly be anti-Semitic to hate Israel because they hate it too. What do you think of that kind of moral distinction that is drawn between anti-Zionist Jews and Zionist Jews, almost like good Jews, bad Jews? Jews we can do business with because they're moral, and Jews we can't do business with because they're the scum of the earth who support this evil state. That has really ugly echoes of the kind of past treatment of Jews, doesn't it? This kind of splitting of them into different camps like this.
Absolutely. It's despicable on all counts. It has horrible echoes, as you say, of the selection made between acceptable Jews and unacceptable Jews, which was part of the destruction of the Jewish people. It is horrific on all counts. But what people also don't realize when they talk about, anti-Zionist Jews being good and Zionist Jews being bad, is this, that certainly not all Jews are Zionists. Not all Jews support Israel. Not all Jews want to live in Israel. Not all Jews believe that, the only place for Jews is in Israel. I mean, this speaks to the broader question of, what is Zionism, which is an issue in itself. But where people go wrong is this, that they think of Zionism as a political ideology. and they think of it as having been invented in the 19th century around Theodor Herzl, who started a train of thought which eventually led to or fed into the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, that's all true as far as it goes, but Zionism is not a political ideology. The Herzl thing in the 19th century was a particular movement that took off for various particular reasons. But all Zionism is the self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. And first of all, if you're an anti-Zionist, then you are singling out the Jews alone as a people who are not entitled to have a homeland in their ancestral place of where they were a nation, where they were a kingdom. They're not entitled to have that homeland at all. So by being anti-Zionist, you are immediately and inescapably being discriminatory and bigoted. But the other thing is this, that while not all Jews are Zionists, Zionism is not in itself a political ideology. Zionism is simply the longing for Zion. Now, the Jewish liturgy, the religious liturgy of synagogue services, is absolutely littered with references to Zion. Why is that? Because Judaism is actually, if you think of it like a three-legged stool, it is the unbreakable fusion of the people, the faith, and the land. Now, that doesn't mean that if you don't support Israel or you don't live in Israel, you're not a Jew. Of course you're a Jew. It doesn't mean that if you're not religiously observant, you're not a Jew. Of course you can be totally unobservant, totally irreligious, and still be a Jew. But it's very important to understand that what the Jewish religion is, what Judaism is the belief by Jews, by religious Jews, that the Jewish people were called upon by the Almighty to live in a particular way according to a particular set of laws in order to produce a very wonderful kind of society governed by all these laws and truth and compassion and all those sorts of things in the land. It was in the land itself. It was related to the land. The various laws are embedded in the land. So if you come along and say, well, there is no justification for Zionism, then you are saying there is no justification for Judaism, because you are trying to separate out and destroy the land component of Judaism. And without that, there is no Judaism. So from that view alone, from that point of view alone, to say, here is an anti-Zionist Jew, and that person is a good Jew, and here is the Zionist Jew, and that person is a bad Jew, quite apart from anything else, it's incoherent, because to be anti-Zionist is to be anti-Judaism.
Yeah, absolutely. Could not agree more. I wanted to talk about the issue of anti-Zionist libels specifically. Many listeners will be familiar with the old anti-Jewish libels, the blood libels of history. We do now have a whole list of anti-Zionist libels. I mean, there are the typical ones that we hear all the time, that the Jewish nation is a uniquely genocidal nation. It's an apartheid regime. It's very murderous. It's, it's very bloodthirsty. We hear that about the Jewish state all the time. And then there are these individual libels, anti-Zionist libels, for example, that the IDF intentionally kills children, possibly even gets a kick from killing children. The latest one, I can't even believe we have to use words like this, but the latest one is the dog rape libel, which has been promoted in the fringe media in the UK, but has now been published even in a column in the New York Times. This idea that the IDF trains dogs to rape Palestinian prisoners, and that's taken as good coin by people all across the internet, and it's used as evidence that this is a uniquely demonic state. Those anti-Zionist libels are very particular to this moment, but they do echo past barbarous lies. What do you think is motoring those libels? And following on from your recent book, which is your handbook for how to deal with this kind of stuff, how do we tackle anti-Zionist libels?
Well, the first thing I would say is that what these libels show me is that the skin of civilization is not only very thin, but has ripped completely. And what we're looking at is primitivism. We're looking at pre-modernity. We're looking at things that were believed by people who did not have modern education, who believed in superstitious mumbo-jumbo, who believed in the devil, and believed that people were devilish. These libels that are coming out today appended to Israel, Israel is a nation of, or the idea, the Israel Defense Forces are baby killers. And I mean, I've had it to my face. You Jews are baby killers. I mean, lots of Jews are getting this the whole time. Now, this is monstrous. It's also ridiculous. It's ludicrous. It's hard to describe quite how out to lunch this all is, except when you look at the past history of anti-Semitism. I'm thinking of the medieval church, when people who believed in devils walking among them believed that the Jews were the devils, and believed that they did kill children for sport and baked their blood in their ritual matzahs, in the unleavened bread used for Passover, this was what came to be called the blood libels, and we hear this today used to describe Israel, which is beyond grotesque. It is absolutely obscene. But the point is this: we hear it used by people who are educated, and who are progressive, who think that they are moral. And this is the real terrible obscenity of the age. Now, where did this come from? Again, this is a very big question. I think there are many rivers that have led into this fetid sewer. But in my view, and I have written this, the single most important factor behind this is the adoption by virtually every progressive person of the Palestine cause. Because for decades, the Palestinian Arabs, and I'm not talking about the Hamas, I'm not talking about people that are thought to be extreme, I'm talking about people who are thought to be moderate, like the Palestinian Authority. But throughout Palestinian society, throughout the Palestinian Authority's educational materials and its sermons and so on, we find precisely this obscene imagery coming out the whole time, drawing upon medieval Christianity and also the Nazi period and the Soviet Union, all of them, all of these periods and regimes which had a murderous, exterminatory attitude to Jews. That is what the Palestinian cause rests on. It's what it teaches its children, that the Israelis drink Arab blood, drink Muslim blood. And so it's a terrible thing, but it has happened that if you have a culture which has adopted the Palestine cause, not just as a cause representing, the oppressed of the earth and you want to help them and so on, but a cause which has come to define and embody morality itself, conscience itself, then it is a shocking thing, but it's perhaps not surprising that you use the language of that so-called supposed moral conscience cause, which is the language of murderous extermination and the literal demonization of Jews, not Israelis, Jews, because that's how the Palestinian Arabs talk about Jews. And so you have this really, it's hard to exaggerate how terrible this is, because the really terrible thing is that, as in the Soviet Union, which exploited all this and brought it on because they knew it would actually fry the Western mind, as with the Soviet Union, the people who are spouting it really don't understand what they're doing. They really believe this is moral. They really believe it's moral to call the Israelis baby killers when the Israeli Defense Forces, as you know, have gone to greater lengths to protect civilian life in the most extraordinarily difficult circumstances in Gaza than any army on earth has ever done. So it is literally putting facts and reality into reverse and producing serial obscenities which are coming out of the mouths of people who purport to be the best of us, who are the people who are moral and decent. So morality itself, conscience in the West, has simply been hijacked and turned into its opposite. And this is, it's like a spiritual plague that has descended upon us. I mean, you know, people don't like this kind of language because it sounds religious, but it's very hard to describe it otherwise because it is outside all rationality. That is what's so terrifying.
Yeah, it does feel like a spiritual plague. I'm not a religious person, but I completely understand your description of it like that. And it seems unquestionable to me now that these anti-Zionist libels are directly causing violence against Jews. You've talked about how you've been shouted at as a baby killer, but if you look at recent events in England, which I did want to ask you about, we saw video clips recently of a visibly Jewish man in Slough being allegedly assaulted by someone calling him a baby killer. We saw the failed so-called asylum seeker who was scaling the fences of the Israeli embassy with knives, and he said he wanted to go in and kill them because of their war on children. And of course, the Heaton Park synagogue killing where 2 Jews were killed on Yom Kippur. The Islamist who did that was reportedly shouting at them, "This is for what you've done to our children." So if you're on the streets of London and Manchester and other cities every other weekend calling the Jewish nation a baby-killing entity and everyone who supports it as the scum of the earth, this is the consequence. So how can we convince people that this anti-Zionist rhetoric, which, as you say, is pretty deranged, is actually endangering Jewish people? That, you know, they will say, we're only criticizing Israel, but actually they're hanging a target sign, as far as I can see, around the necks of Jews everywhere.
Absolutely, as is being borne out now daily, really, in Britain. I mean, you know, I'm looking at the news every day, and every day there are more attacks on Jews in the streets in Britain. I mean, the terrible thing is that such is this climate and such is the brainwashing that's gone on about Israel for so long that it's very hard for even the best, the most sort of energetic of pro-Israel people to counter this. And there is also something else going on here which makes it so difficult to counter, which is not something that can be proved, but I believe it to be true, that you have to ask why the image of the Israeli as the Nazi has been so enthusiastically received. And the short answer is that it's the West's get out of jail free card, because the West is guilty. It feels guilty about what the West collectively did to the Jewish people. It feels terrible about it, even if it wasn't directly involved. But it was all party to it by not fighting Hitler until the last minute, and thus ensuring that the Holocaust actually happened, by barring the doors of Britain and every country to fleeing Jews. But more than that, I think, you know, this terrible thing, the Holocaust, came out of Europe. It came out of Germany, which was considered to be the acme of high culture, modernity, science, all the things that we think are, you know, carry the Western virtue of reason and rationality and progress and all those sorts of things. So I think the West has a very big problem with this. But there is something else that has come out, which is, and this again was said to my face some years ago, and it's really shocking, but I believe it to be an important part of this terrible poisonous mix, that, anti-Semitism is always with us. And in Britain, there is a cultural kind of reservoir of prejudice against Jews. The most we can ever hope for is that it's kept down. It's relegated to the fringes, and unfortunately, what's happened is that the reservoir has burst the dam, if I'm not mixing my metaphor, and is now flooding around us. But the point is this, that and it's been said to my face that it's such a relief that Israel's behavior enables people to say what they think about the Jews in a way that they couldn't in the decades immediately after the discovery of Auschwitz and the extermination camps. It all went underground. What went underground? Well, our ability to say what we like about Jews. Or what do you want to say about Jews? Well, we want to say what we think about them. What do you think about them? Well, we want to say things like, they run everything. They run everything in their own interests, and they put the rest of us, at risk. All those sorts of things. In other words, it's given the alleged crimes of Israel have given permission to people to be prejudiced against, to expound in public their prejudices against Jews once again. Now, this is a terrible thing. So what can be done? Well, you're dealing, as I say, with a civilizational deformation, a spiritual monstrosity. So it's very hard to deal with it. But what has enabled it to roar with ever increasing ferocity through our culture is the virtual silence of all in positions of cultural authority, the political class and the professional classes, the churches, for goodness sake. Now, it's not enough for them to say, as they said after the stabbings of whenever it was, a week or so ago, in Golders Green. It's not enough for all these hypocrites to come out and beat their breasts and say, oh my goodness, we can't possibly allow this to happen. There is no place for anti-Semitism in Britain. We value our Jews. These are the people who day in, day out are vilifying Israel with not criticism, but with demonization based on lies. Lies which are so foul, as we've just been discussing. If people are considered to be genocidal, committing a genocide in Gaza, however stupid that is, but if they are considered to be doing that, if they're considered to be baby killers, then they are evil. And if you tell people that Israelis are evil, it therefore follows that anyone who supports them is evil. So most Jews support Israel, so most Jews are evil. And if you tell people that day in, day out, then you're not going to be surprised. You shouldn't be surprised if people take matters into their own hands and start attacking them. Now, the response from the political class downwards should be not just anti-Semitism is really bad and we're against it and we're going to protect Jews and we're going to have more police on the streets. It's pathetic. Pathetic. What they should be saying is this whole atmosphere is driven by a lie. It's a lie. You are being told that Israel is behaving in this way. It's a lie. Israel is going to lengths not known by any army anywhere in the world to protect human life. For example, you are told that Israel is an illegal occupier of Palestinian land. This is a lie. It is only the Jews who, in international law, in treaty law, which Britain itself signed in 1922, it is only the Jews who are entitled to that land. Now, the idea that any politician is going to come forward and say that is, it's unthinkable. But that's what needs to be done. This thing has to be, this is a boil that needs to be lanced properly, because as long as people believe that Israel is behaving unconscionably in Gaza, but more than that, is itself an unconscionable occupation of somebody else's land. As long as they believe that central lie, they are always going to be very prone to accept the other lies they're being told about its behavior. Now, you know, if the governing class, the governing cultural class were to say these things, the atmosphere would change overnight. Overnight. There would be a row. Certain members of our community would undoubtedly jump up and down and say this is untrue and so on. But people would be alerted to facts of which they are currently totally ignorant. And that is what can be done. It's what should be done. It's what's not going to be done.
Yeah, this obsession with separating out criticism of Israel, as they call it, which is not criticism of Israel, it's anti-Zionist demonization. The desire to separate that out from what's happening on the streets is just increasingly untenable. I really think we need to, as you say, lance that boil by telling the truth, which is that the big lie behind all of this is what we are told about Israel every single day of the week, from the establishment, from popular culture, from the media. I mean, that's what's feeding into precisely this environment that we see. I did want to, just on the Golders Green issue, obviously there's not that much we can say about the suspect himself, because it's a live case. People will have seen some of the clips, or they will certainly know what happened. 2 visibly Jewish men were stabbed in Golders Green. The thing that struck me after Golders Green is what you've just been touching on there, which is the unwillingness to have an honest discussion about the extent of the problem and the nature of the problem. So the suspect in this particular alleged attack came to the country as a child, reportedly from Somalia. He's someone of the Islamic faith. We know that a lot of the attacks on Jews over the past 2.5 years have been carried out by people of an Islamist persuasion. We know that when the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans were so unjustly prevented from going to Birmingham last year to watch their team play against Aston Villa, that was because local Islamists had threatened to go onto the streets and beat up some of these Jews, and the police kowtowed to that. One of the things that people are really unwilling to discuss is that a lot of this hatred, in terms of certainly its more violent manifestation, is coming from a certain sections of a certain community in Britain. We need to start being honest about that, don't we, if we want to solve these problems?
Absolutely. There are 2 parts to this problem of anti-Semitism, this phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Which is, the non-Muslim population and the Muslim population. It would be wrong to say that this thing started with and is mainly concerns the Muslim population of Britain. It's not true. I remember being very, very concerned about its eruption back in the 1980s. Before there was a significant Muslim population at all. But there's no doubt that in recent years, it has been led by Islamists, by people who are using the Palestinian cause to advance an agenda which actually has the West itself in its sights. I have described the Palestinian cause as a Trojan horse that's being used so that a lot of well-meaning non-Muslims are being suborned through their support for the Palestinian cause into becoming the unwitting foot soldiers of the Islamic Jihad. The Hamas in particular makes no bones about the fact that, after we've destroyed Israel and the Jews, they say, the West is next, Jerusalem and then Rome. And that's always been part of the Palestinian cause, which is basically, insofar as it is all about the destruction of Israel and destruction of Jews, it is Islamist at its core. And people don't realize that at all, obviously. In Britain, I don't need to tell you, it is extraordinarily difficult to talk about this. Now, some progress has been made. Even a couple of years ago, it would have been pretty unthinkable for a politician as brave as Nick Timothy of the Conservative Party to stand up and call it out in the way that he has, as you mentioned, over the Maccabi Aston Villa imbroglio, which was so fundamentally unjust and such an illustration of the way in which behavior by public bodies in Britain has been so badly corrupted by fear of the Muslim community and the more radical elements in it. So it certainly needs to be called out. And again, this Labour government, however long it's going to last in its present incarnation, its response to all of this is to try and introduce some way of litigating Islamophobia, which, prejudice against Muslims is bad, prejudice against anybody is bad, but Islamophobia is a term of art invented by the Muslim Brotherhood, who intend to take over the West, in order to suppress legitimate and necessary debate and discussion about anything that is questionable or bad in the Islamic world. So, the government has gone to the opposite, in the opposite direction, and is kowtowing to these forces, which mean that it's extraordinarily difficult to even talk about it. And there is no prospect at the moment of this attempt to Islamize Britain, attempt to force Britain's culture to adapt to a minority rather than the minority adapting to British culture, which is what every other minority does. So, there are many, one has to say this, but it is true. There are many British Muslims who are fine, who pose no threat to anybody. But there are thousands and thousands of them who do. It's, what is it? They are about 6%, let's think of an estimated 6% of the population, but form something like 90% of the active suspects on the security service lists of people who have to be watched or who are causing concern from a security point of view. So there is an enormous problem, which is not ever talked about properly, and discussion about it is suppressed. Now, this doesn't just lead to a climate of impunity when it comes to relative impunity when it comes to attacks on Jews. It is suicidal from the point of view of a culture that is trying to that needs to defend itself against an attack, an internal attack.
I always remember that there was a time in the 2010s when there were more British Muslims in ISIS than there were in the British Army, and it's not racist to talk about that. We have to be very honest about these problems in our society, what's causing them and what we can do about them. Okay, Melanie, my last question for you kind of follows on from that. Last time you were on the podcast, we talked about your brilliant new book, Fighting the Hate, which is a guidebook for a handbook, I think you call it, for Jews under siege. And I've been enjoying your video clips on Instagram, giving people advice on how to argue back against anti-Zionists and anti-Semites. Very useful. But I guess my question for you is, what about non-Jews under siege? Because, I want to ask you about how you think those of us who are not Jewish, but who are incredibly worried about the culture that you've just been describing, what we can do or how we can convince more non-Jews that this is going to come for them at some point too, because this culture that you're describing, especially the anti-Zionist lunacy, is indicative, as you say, of a culture slowly committing suicide. So how do we get people to understand that, do you think?
Well, first of all, millions do understand it. And they're the people who are voting for Nigel Farage because they think, rightly or wrongly, that he's the only person who's going to stem this tide. I mean, I personally don't know, but anyway, that's what people believe. So, there are already loads of people out there. They need champions. They need to feel braver. They need to feel supported, so that they will become braver. I mean, one of the things that is so important is that if you're up against a terrible thing, if you feel you're on your own, then you really haven't got much way of fighting it. And when I say if you feel you're on your own, I don't just mean you look around and you don't have, allies who are prepared to stand up with you. You feel on your own because you're not sure that you're right. You're listening to all this stuff telling you, that you're racist and you're Islamophobic and you're a troglodyte and you're right wing and you're ultra right wing and you're a neo-Nazi, and you think, am I? I mean, are all these people wrong? And if you feel alone, if you don't hear other people standing up saying what you're saying or what you're thinking, then you're likely to get very demoralized and think, well, I don't think I'm a bad person, but perhaps I am. So it's terribly important that people feel supported by other people saying what they're saying. So it's very important that people gather into social circles of like-minded people. They can be virtual circles, they can be on the internet, but that they come up against people who think like them. Because one thing I've noticed in talking about the couple of books I've written recently which touch on all these issues is that the sense of relief when people hear me speak is absolutely overwhelming. And they say, thank you for saying this because I thought I was going mad. And they're being gaslighted all the time. And they don't know what to think. They're reading, the mainstream media. They're listening to BBC and Sky. They are listening to the bishops of the Church of England. They're listening to the politicians. And they don't hear what they, in their gut, feel to be true. And so when they find somebody who is in public life, that is to say, has a public platform of some kind, they are so grateful and so relieved, and it makes them braver. It makes them able to stand up, not just stand up for what they believe in public. Some of them will never speak in public, but first of all, for themselves to believe what they believe is true. And then to seek out like-minded people, and then to be a bit braver about, associating with people who are going to collectively get together and do stuff, whatever it is. It may be petitions to an MP, it may be organizing a local event, whatever it is, it's worth doing because it helps change the atmosphere, because the more people do that, the more other people see it, and then it kind of snowballs. And that's really all you can do. I mean, the advice that I give in the book you've kindly mentioned, Fighting the Hate, is directed specifically at the Jewish community, because it's the Jewish community that's getting it personally, viscerally. You are a baby killer. I mean, that has to be dealt with. But the point you make is absolutely one that I absolutely take, that we're living in a culture which is under siege, a culture which is under attack. And there are millions of people who are desperate to fight that. They don't know how to do so. And so it has to be very local. It has to be people of like minds getting together and supporting each other and believing that what they feel and what they think is true and right. And it means, more people standing up in public like you do, but people becoming braver in public life. Nick Timothy, I think, is a good example. I think Kemi Badenoch is also starting to do this. This changes the atmosphere. It changes the tone. It puts the enemies of civilization on the back foot, because for the first time they're having to defend what they're saying, what they're thinking, rather than attack, which they do through devious means by character assassination and all that kind of terrible stuff. So it helps to change the atmosphere in a very productive way. But you have to have critical mass. You have to have enough public figures to do that. Well, maybe, as this threat grows, which I'm afraid it's going to, maybe we're going to find more public figures doing that who will embolden and make braver everybody else.
Melanie, thank you very much.
Thank you.